This is Teazle Wood, an area of ancient woodland on the edge of the M25 in Mole Valley. It is a site of nature conservation importance. Its long history as an area of woodland has resulted in a rich and complex association of living organisms, of which the most obvious feature, its trees, are only a very small part. The woodland here has not been managed for many years, and its future was uncertain until an initiative, begun within the community of North Leatherhead, raised the funds to buy it. Since then, volunteers have been sensitively managing the site to restore important habitats, such as the ponds. They have been guided by expert advice and careful survey work to establish the value of the woodland ecologically. Heritage Open Days this year is a celebration of hidden nature. To demonstrate the hidden nature within Teazle Wood, Professor Hawksworth visited the site to look in particular at the fungi and lichen there. He touches on issues of climate change, pollution, and complex processes that are hidden beneath our feet. As a reminder of the world outside the woodland, the constant hum of the motorway provides a background to Professor Hawksworth's commentary.
There's lots of different plants around in the understory of the woodland, and as in many other cases, these will support different organisms. In fact, a study was done some years ago looking at the numbers of different kinds of organisms restricted to particular plant species. That include nematodes, bacteria, insects, parasites on the insects, as well as fungi and so on. And that worked out about 12 as a mean value. Nettle is a particularly interesting one, so it has over 90 species of fungi recorded from nettles, of which I think 18 are only known from nettles, and it also has very special butterflies and things associated with it as well. So nettle is a very valuable plant. We also have here a lot of brambles actually, and I've been looking to see if one is infected with a particular rust fungus, and which doesn't quite have the right sporing structures on the leaves at the moment. But often when you see bramble leaves, they will have little purpley patches on the surface, and if you turn them over, they can be either orange or black depending on the time of year. And this has been found to be very valuable. This is a rust fungus, and it's been found to be very valuable in a murder case once involving Professor Wiltshire, who was going to be giving some of this presentation today, because it has different sporing states at different times of the year, and so that helped actually work out when a particular person had died. We have a different species of Boletus here, you see with the red fleckings on the stem. And again, it has been chewed a bit at the top by a snail or something, but also there's a little whitish fluff on the top as well, and that's a different fungus that grows on the decaying sporing structures of these particular fungi. So one thing is living off another one yet again, very specialised habitats. We've not seen many larger fungi in the woods today. When these actually produce their sporing structures, the mushrooms above ground, depends very much on the conditions and how wet and warm it has been. We've had a lot of warmth and we've had a lot of rain recently, but it's obviously not quite suited them, so we've not found too many. But it is interesting that with the climate changing, the time in which you can collect mushrooms, which used to be very much restricted to the autumn, is now extended, so you can find now species that you normally look for just in the autumn producing their sporophores, their sporing mushroom structures, perhaps even in June or July. So the whole season has been extended for these generally autumnal things quite markedly. Trees themselves are also habitats for other things, and particularly lichen fungi and mosses will grow on these. And they do like some light, however, the lichens, and so when the trees are felled, or there's a storm and pieces fall to the ground, Then you'll also see the rich lichen communities. There's an assemblage of different leafy lichens on here, some of which are quite sensitive to sulfur dioxide air pollution. And if you watch the presentation on Mickleham in Church, you'll remember that I said something about the pollution effects of the nitrogen-loving lichens there. Well, these aren't nitrogen-loving ones, these are ones that don't really like nitrogen, but they are very affected by sulfur dioxide. So when you see some of these communities, it means you've got really clean air from the point of view of that pollutant, not necessarily other pollutants. Different fungi are involved in wood decay on the ground. And these little black spots on here are one of the sac fungi, one of the ascomycetes that bursts through the bark and forms these little black structures. Because when the trees actually die, these appear right along the branches on the ground. They're not obviously being colonised from one point. They're obviously in there. The fungus was in there waiting for the branch to die before it started to produce its sporing structures and to start decaying the wood itself. There's a little tiny mushroom. You may think of mushrooms just as large things you can eat, but some of them are very small. This one is only perhaps 1.5 centimetres tall, little mycena, and these aren't part of the population that lives in the trees or association with the roots, but they are involved in decaying materials again, and this has colonised a bit of bark that's fallen away and is making sure that gets destroyed and returned. There's been various things occurring above the ground, but what's happening actually underneath? We mentioned the special mycorrhizal fungi that are forming associations with the trees and helping the trees to do well, but also in the soil itself there are different communities not particularly associated with the trees, but fungi interacting with other organisms, and many different species can be found if you do experiments and grow the fungi from the soil. And these are a very wide range of different kinds of fungi involved. A lot of them are cellulose decomposers, for example, eating those parts of the leaf matter, but also interacting with different invertebrate groups, and particularly the collembolums in the soil, and some nematodes are largely fungus feeders. So again, there is a whole separate little mini ecosystem, if you like, going on in the soil itself, different organisms eating one another and providing nutrients from one another and surviving in that way. This little lichen on the twigs, which occurs in well-lit places, is quite interesting. This is called oak moss, and it was very much prized in the perfume industry. An oil gets extracted from it, which is used to make some of the more expensive French perfumes, because it reduces the rate in which some of the aromatic compounds actually become volatile and escape, and this is sought after and collected specifically for the mushrooms, for the perfume industry. And it's also quite interesting in that some birds are particularly partial to this and will seek this one out to help make their nests, particularly long-tailed tits, which will even separate this out from similarly coloured, rather little bushy lichens, and to embroider their nests with. This is Laetiporus sulphureus, a chicken in the woods, which is actually edible, but a certain percentage of the population that eat it becomes sick. So it's not necessarily recommended that you try it, particularly a large amount for a first time, in case you are one of those that do react violently to it. This diffed mushroom here, this is living on the dead wood, and if you look underneath this one, it has little gills, and these are very important features to look at if you're identifying mushrooms. But you have to be careful if you're identifying things that you might want to eat. There are about 14,500 fungus species in Britain, and about roughly 2,000 or so of those are mushrooms. And if you try and identify them, this can be quite tricky, because the guidebooks only include some of the species, and it can be very dangerous to actually try and identify things from the colour guides that are around, because they will only have a selection of the species that are around there, and you may well find that you have something which isn't in the book. So be very, very careful and be very cautious about trying to experiment and eat anything if you're not really sure what it was or what it is, because people do get caught out, and sometimes this can be quite dramatic. There's one fungus particularly that was not thought to be dangerous. In fact, it wasn't even described as new to science. In Finland, it was sold in a market, and I think something like 30 people died as a result. And also don't necessarily believe people that seem to be knowledgeable. We had a classic case in Spain where I was working at one time, where the Madrid Mycological Society had a field excursion. They collect things and they eat them at the end of the day. And the chef said, "Oh, we eat this one a lot. This is very good to eat." The professional mycologist from the Madrid Botanic Garden said, "Oh no, it's poisonous, don't." And they believed the chef. 19 of them ended up in hospital. Nobody died. So it is important to believe the specialist mycologist, somebody that studies mushrooms, that looks at them carefully microscopically, rather than necessarily people that think things are safe to eat, because some things are very similar looking indeed. So another thing about eating mushrooms is being very wary, even if things look as though they're properly labelled. There was a case where a mycologist at Kew looked at some porcini mushrooms, allegedly from China, in a packet, and because he did molecular work, he did DNA studies on the specimens in this packet, sold as a particularly sought after edible species. None of them were that species. 3 of them were species that were new to science, so nobody knows what their toxicity or otherwise would be. So you really have to be very, very careful indeed. They are actually quite a good thing to eat, particularly if you're a vegetarian, because fungi are more related to animals than plants. So they have various vitamins and so on in them, which you don't normally easily get if you're a vegetarian from eating vegetarian foods. They also contain large amounts of water and roughage, so they can actually be quite good if you're on a diet, because you will feel full and won't necessarily get a huge amount of nutrients out of them, but some of the things you do get may be ones that are particularly good for you.